Kia ora te whānau, a iho karate ko, Andrew Doubleday ho. Today we're looking at the Gospel for Sunday the 31st of August 2025. The Gospel lectionary is actually Luke chapter 14 verses 1, then jumps across to verses 7 through to 14. Today I'm going to include verses 2 to 6, so it'll be Luke 14 verses 1 through to 14. Because it seems to me that when we consider those verses, it gives a kind of basis for all that follows. The reality is, it's easy to get caught in set patterns of thinking without any reference on what and how we're thinking. This passage causes us to consider the values we hold and of how we might imagine our values compare with what's important to God. So, Luke chapter 14 verse 1. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. Just then, in front of him, there was a man who had dropsy. And Jesus asked the lawyers and Pharisees, "Is it lawful to cure people on the Sabbath or not?" But they were silent. So Jesus took him and healed him and sent him away. Then he said to them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that has fallen into a well, will you not immediately pull it out on the Sabbath day?" And they could not reply to this. When he noticed how the guest chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. "When you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by the host. And the host that invited both of you may come and say to you, 'Give this person your place,' and then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest seat. But when you're invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." He said also to the one who'd invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends, or your brothers, or your relatives, or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Let's notice how this passage starts. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. Just then, in front of him, there was a man who had dropsy. I want to suggest to you that this was a setup. They had gathered for a meeting, for a meal on the Sabbath. Okay, it's the Sabbath here that's important. What we see is an attempt at trapping Jesus. Presumably, this is the evening of the Sabbath. This is the evening of the Friday. And the food had been prepared during the day, with the Sabbath starting around sundown. Because that's when it starts, on the Friday around sundown, and finishes at sundown on the Saturday. So once you get to sundown on the Saturday, everything goes back to normal. In 1998, Lynn and I, with our youngest son, were in Jerusalem. We're actually right at the time of the 50th anniversary of statehood for Israel. It wasn't intended, it just happened that that's when we were there. And on the Friday afternoon, late in the afternoon, we wanted to eat. We needed to eat somewhere. So we walked into the center of the city and it was dead. There was not a soul about. This would have been 5 o'clock in the early evening. There was not a person about. and everything was closed except for one place. McDonald's. You can count on McDonald's. So we went in there because we also knew what we were going to get, because McDonald's is McDonald's wherever you are, to get some food. So we had a meal there, and when we came out, the whole of the centre of the city had changed. It was now party central. The sun had gone down. This is Saturday night. The sun had gone down, and the shops had all opened up, the food bars had all opened up, there were families, there were children, there was all sorts of stuff going on. As I say, it was a shock to see the absolute difference between the two. So this is how seriously the Sabbath is celebrated, and what goes along with it. So Jesus is invited to come after sundown on the Friday evening, not the Saturday as we were going into town, on the Friday evening, I want to suggest, and the Sabbath has now officially started. The Sabbath clock is running. And they are watching, and it says they are watching Jesus closely. The text is very clear. Why? Because they're trying, and they're about to ambush him. The fix is in. They have someone who needs his healing help. But Jesus, of course, he's not stupid. He sees it for what it is, and he calls it out. Is it lawful, he asked, to cure people on the Sabbath or not? And their response? They were silent. They're not saying a word. They're just wanting to see what he does. He has little choice given who he is and what he is. They had him, or so they thought. So what does Jesus do? Well, he heals the man and sends him on his way, and then he challenges them. He challenges their logic, he challenges their thinking processes. He says to them, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well, won't you immediately pull it out on the Sabbath day? Previously, not far back in Luke's Gospel, he's already challenged them that on the Sabbath they lead out their stock for food and for water. He's saying, don't you see, you're already making exceptions when it suits you. What is it that so offends you, he could be asking, about healing someone on the Sabbath? Do you imagine that God is going to be deeply offended by this action? What kind of God is this that you worship and seek to obey? The response of the Pharisees to Jesus, they could not reply to this, so they said nothing. As I said, this is not the first time, and apparently it makes no difference. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He spreads the spray of his engagement wider, and this may point to the underlying reasoning. Why people should not come to the synagogue on the Sabbath day for healing. It's clear that blindness was regarded by the strict religious people as a judgment of God. You've just got to go through the Gospels to see that to be the case. So why not other afflictions like illnesses and diseases like leprosy and people who were crippled and lame, and a sign of God's disfavour, of God's disapproval, of God's judgment against that person. Therefore, coming for healing was pushing back against the judgment of God. Surely God had decided, God had made a judgment. This is the consequence. So coming for healing, particularly on the Sabbath of all days, might have been regarded as sacrilege. And to come expecting it in a holy place like the synagogue just made it worse. It might be regarded as being presumptive, risking defiling both the Sabbath and the synagogue. So come back another day for your healing, if such a thing is at all possible. Was this how it was? Well, I don't know. The truth is, I'm speculating. But it does make some sense of their resistance, doesn't it? And perhaps to us, in the third decade of the 21st century, it sounds silly. Yet, I just remember back that I had a very significant older leader in the parish who suffered from crippling headaches. This was a double affliction for her, because she had been taught and she believed that sickness was God's judgment against her. Where did this teaching come from? Well, I asked her. And she'd been taught that it came from Deuteronomy 34:7, where it says Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. So she'd been taught that this was the model for all faithful followers of Jesus. It's what that they could expect, that she would be healthy and in the fullness of strength until the day that Jesus took her to be with herself. Yet these headaches laid her low, confined her to her bed, sometimes for days. And with the grief that she must have been a terrible person, the worst of sinners, because God was punishing her. Yet others, the reality is, saw her as a saint. So what we're seeing here is a kind of hierarchy of the deserving and the undeserving. And this creates a kind of ladder with the rich and powerful at the top, because they were only rich and powerful because they were regarded as particularly holy. Now, I kid you not, that is what they thought. You've only got to read the accounts of Jesus and the rich young ruler to see that to be the case. Particularly Jesus' interchange with the disciples at the end of that encounter. Very clear that in the day they equated success, prosperity, power with holiness. That people who had all these benefits were approved by God because they were particularly good people, even if it was obviously not the case. God was blessing them. And when they were poor and sick, it's because they were undeserving. They were not holy enough. They were under the judgment of God, and therefore they could not be blessed by God. So there's a social hierarchy, and Jesus refers to it in all that follows. So he says, when you come to a function, he says, you jockey for the best places. The closer to the top table, the better. It reaffirms your status, it reaffirms your approval, it reaffirms your holiness. So he offers a kind of parable. When you're invited to an event like this, he suggests, do the counterintuitive thing. Take the lowest seat. Allow the host to elevate you, because that will lift your mana indeed. Imagine how bad and humiliating it would be if you took the place you believe befitted your status and were asked to take a lower place. Now the reality is, I know what this is like because it's actually happened to me, and not that long ago. I was invited to a significant event in the life of the wider church, and it was an induction of someone to a high role, and I was invited to participate in the procession at the beginning, which starts at the very back of the church and goes and escorts a person to the front. Now, there were some questions about dress, because I tend to just simply wear a suit, and they remained unresolved. But I turned up, and on the day I was assured that all would be fine, everything would be car pie. So I met one of my colleagues, and we spent a good bit of time together. We went down and we were with everybody else, and we're given instructions about what we're to do, and the procession starts, and off we go. And halfway down the middle of this building, we're halfway down the aisle, and all the other guests and officials are all on either side of us. I say to my colleague, oh, it looks like we have to sort of peel off to the left just down here. And he said to me, actually, there's a seat for me. He says, with my name in it, but there isn't one for you. And I thought, are you telling me now? You're telling me now? You knew this, you've known this for the last half an hour, and you're telling me now? and we're getting up towards the front, and I have to find somewhere to go, so I slip off to the side, and there's a row of people there, and I find a seat at the end that doesn't have anybody in it, and I say to the person next to me, is it okay I sit here? No, he says, that seat is for someone else, and there's a whole crew of people coming in behind. It was part of the mihi, and the tangata whenua contingent were to be sitting there. So I stayed for that part, and the mihi started, and the person giving it, he acknowledged me, not me personally in my name, but acknowledged that the person from the Uniting Congregations was here to be part of and honour this part of this process. So I know I was supposed to be here, there just wasn't a seat for me. And when that finished, of course, then all the people filled in and came to fill the seats, and I had to slip off and further down the side. Well, there were no seats, except there was one at the end of a row, which had the person's name on a wonderfully printed and I can't remember the word for it. Anyway, it was there with his name and his role, and he was a newspaper reporter, and this was the row where all the reporters were sitting, and he hadn't turned up. So I sat there and spent the next 2 hours sitting in a place that wasn't my place for the duration. Now, it was embarrassing and it was somewhat humiliating, yet I was aware that there was no malice intended by the host. I was simply an oversight. I was, to be honest, a little bit ticked off with my colleague for allowing me to fall into this place. So I know how it feels to be subject to this kind of demotion. Here's the thing though, as I've reflected on it subsequently, and just over the last few days as I've been preparing for this talk, I realised that I did have a sense of entitlement, that I did expected to be seen, and because of the role that I held, and the event bumped me back to earth. Now, I did stay for the after-match function, or for a bit of it. I had a little of their food, I socialised with a number of people, then found my car and drove home, chastened and humbled by the experience. And in our story, Jesus addresses the host. He says, don't invite all the knobs, all the important, all the significant people, in case they invite you back. And that's literally what it means, in case they invite you back. And you think, but isn't that the whole point? Don't you want them to invite you back? And it's an exercise in self-aggrandizement, to establish oneself surely somewhere in the pecking order. But Jesus suggests an alternative strategy. He says, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. Wow. So there's a promise of blessing in here, even though you don't imagine that's what's likely to happen, but it will. It's counterintuitive to be saying, do this, you will be blessed, and you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So Jesus is inviting his hearers, inviting us, to get off the status-seeking treadmill. And he immediately then goes on to tell another parable about a great feast. Now, this continues beyond the reading we've had today from the lectionary. But it's at the same event, at the same time, at the same place. It's as if we should have kept on reading beyond verse 14, because it's all part of a whole. And he tells this story, this parable of this rich person who prepares a fabulous banquet and invites everybody who's anybody who's somebody, the people who are significant, important, to be there. And what happens? They all make excuses. None of them are coming. None are willing, in the end, to affirm his place in the social order. And this makes him really quite angry. So he sends out his servants to scour the highways and the byways, ultimately to look under the hedges, to bring in everybody, so that his banqueting hall is full. Now, as a reject from the society he craves, he's forced to turn to those he might have previously despised. And Jesus is perhaps suggesting that this might have been a much better starting place. That God prioritizes the undeserving in worldly terms, despises the whole concept of first and last, of winners and losers, of up and down, the hierarchical society that is so obvious and so ever present. And he also invites us to step off that treadmill of making judgments of those who deserve to be in and those who are clearly out, making judgments about choices they've made and their social status of putting them in that place, and of using social status as a measure of God's preference of who is holy and approved of, and who is beneath contempt and disdained and worthy of judgment. Because ultimately, in God's regime, our values are often turned upside down, because the first will be last, and the last will be first. Amen. God bless you.